Hello and welcome. We're so happy you could join us for the new season of The Catholic View for Women. Of course, it's a show dedicated to news and views of women, but from a truly Catholic perspective. I'm Teresa Tomeo, one of the co-hosts here of this fabulous program on EWTN. I also host a daily Catholic morning program on EWTN radio called Catholic Connection. To my right is one of my co-hosts, as I mentioned, Astrid Bena-Gutierrez. She is with the Los Angeles Pregnancy Services and Hispanics for Life. Good to see you again, girlfriend. Great to be back on set. And of course, Janet Marana, who is the Executive Director of Priests for Life and also the co-founder of the Silent No More awareness campaign. Here we are, ladies. Season 3. We're back again. Very exciting stuff.
And you know, we have to thank all the women who have been emailing us when they watch the program.
We have lots of men who are
doing. Some men. I mean, we've even gotten emails from some people in Africa, over in Europe. I mean, they're watching the program, and we took their input, all these suggestions. Remember, like we kind of said, okay, what are the 10 or 12 most popular? And this season is based on viewer response, and we want them to know that.
And testimonies.
The things that were of concern to them. Can you delve into these things? They're going to see that on this season.
And that's really what the show is about. It's the Catholic View for Women. We want to hear from Catholic women and, of course, men as well, but really to give a different perspective that's not available out there right now in the current talk shows.
And so much is going on in the world today, so we want to bring out the truth. The Catholic Church always brings out the truth, and we want to uncover this treasure and help people share it.
Well, and as you know, I was a revert back like you, Teresa, and I always feel like one of the things I still struggle with is my knowledge of the saints. You know, I know you do great on the radio, Teresa. You're always talking about the saints, but I feel like other than like the big ones, St. Catherine of Siena, St. Teresa, I start to get, squishy-wishy about all the other saints. I don't know enough about them. And I feel like, poorly catechized. So what we decided to do for this season is to every show highlight a saint. And being I'm the saint ignorant person here that's trying to read more, Janet's going to have her little saints of the episode. And for this episode,
which, by the way, we should give the title of this episode.
Oh, yes.
And we'll get into that in a second and explain, because each of the saints that we've chosen can easily be associated with the topic.
For the episode.
Right. So this episode is called What Catholic Women Think, and it's based on a very interesting report that came out last year, right before the election.
That's right.
It's all about what Catholic women think about faith and also about contraception. Faith, the Church, and contraception. Let me have the full title here. Is actually What Catholic Women Think About Faith, Conscience, and Contraception. And we'll get into details on this really fascinating report in just a bit. But go ahead.
Okay, so the first saint we're going to deal with is St. Teresa Benedicta of the Cross, and her feast day is August the 9th. And we chose her because she was a philosopher and a teacher and was very outspoken in her support of the church. And I think that's what we're going to delve into here, because women, if you know the faith, you're going to speak up for the faith. And it's those who don't know it, they criticize the church. Right. So St. Teresa Benedicta is our model, and here's just a little bit about her. Her name was Edith Stein, and she was born in Poland in 1891 into a Jewish-German family. Although raised in the Jewish tradition, at 14, Edith declared herself an atheist. She studied philosophy with fine results and was drawn to the Catholic faith, and she converted and received baptism in 1922. Her career as a teacher was interrupted by the racist Nuremberg laws, and she entered the Carmelite convent of Cologne, taking the name of Teresa Benedicta of the Cross. And in 1942, she was deported to the extermination camp of Auschwitz, where she died in a gas chamber. She was canonized in 1998. She is depicted in her Carmelite habit, and she's known as the patron saint of Europe since 1999, along with St. Bridget of Sweden and Catherine of Siena. And of course, the name Teresa is of Greek and German origin, which means huntress, and another meaning is strong and a strong woman.
That's how I spell my name, Teresa. And it also has to do with harvesting. It means a harvester too, which makes a lot of sense if you think of St. Edith Stein or Teresa Benedicta. And Astrid and I were talking about how much we really love her. She's phenomenal.
Absolutely, and she was one of the intellectuals, Catholic intellectuals of the 19th century. So she's somebody that we can look to as someone who
she was a feminist.
Was very,
she was
feminist,
in her day.
very accomplished. She was a professor.
Speaker.
A speaker. But the more that she learned, the more that she realized, who God was, and that her life was meant to be a gift to others, to be of service to others. And the beautiful thing is that the things that helped her to convert were not these necessarily these theories that she was learning. It was noticing these simple moments, like seeing a Catholic woman coming out of the church in the middle of a busy day and observing how this woman, you know, is so different from others. What does she have?
Right.
Why is she in that church in the middle of a busy day? And then reading the life of Teresa of
That
Avila.
actually changed her life.
Exactly.
She read her autobiography and said, "This is truth."
This is
and
truth.
that's I love that sentence. This is truth, and then that
Absolutely.
led to her
And of course,
conversion.
women who watch the show, they say like, well, how do I convince, especially we're going to talk about contraception in the show. We know that's a hot button issue, right? So how do I talk to friends I know that are contracepting? Well, you need to pray to Saint Teresa Benedicta of the Cross, because she learned how to be outspoken. And if you want that gift of how to get someone to move in the right direction with the church's teaching, we take her and pray for her and ask for her
Yes.
intercession help.
If you
us.
think about the saints, and I think sometimes, and I think the reason that I'm into them so much is because when I finally came back to my Catholic faith, I started looking for people to whom I could relate, and so I started doing a little bit of studying, and now I'm just crazy about the saints. But if you think about what the church gives us, and sometimes we tend to look at the saints as people like in far off places who lived centuries ago, and that they can't relate to us. But they truly can. And St. Teresa Benedicta, we're also going to be talking about St. Gianna Beretta Molla in another episode. There's a lot of saints that actually lived at St. Teresa of Lisieux, of course, was late 1800s, early 1900s. So a lot of them are actually very close to us in terms of the time span. So they're not so far off. Now, there are plenty that we can still relate to that are centuries before us. But if you look at Poland, if you look at St. Teresa Benedicta, John Paul II, St. Maximilian Kolbe, St. Faustina, all from that country, all about the same time,
Right.
coming forward, but they didn't know each other. But think of the wealth of holiness that was brought out of that century in that one country with these
Absolutely.
saints.
And the deeper we dig into the life of someone like St. Teresa Benedicta of the Cross, Edith Stein, we realize that at some point they realized, you know, I can't do this with my own powers.
Right.
I have to rely on God. If I want to convince others, it's not going to be being a very clever debater. It's got to be about my prayer life. It's got to be about letting the Holy Spirit take over and being completely abandoned to Him. So that's the ultimate lesson, I think, with the saints, is just the ultimate abandonment and letting God completely take over, like St. Paul says. It's no longer that I live, but Christ
who
lives in me.
But I also think, Astrid, that's a great point in terms of what we're going to be talking about in this episode, in terms of what Catholic women think about faith, conscience, and contraception, because it is a very, very deep concept, and it's a big picture concept in terms of understanding why the church teaches what she teaches us about contraception. And her saying about St. Teresa of Avila, this is truth. This is also truth, the church teaching. And Janet and I know, because we were, you know, we always talk about us being the bad girls gone good, thanks be to God. And for many years, my husband and I contracepted, and it wasn't until after we came back to the church, had our reversion, went to confession. And it's interesting the way our relationship changed when we finally accepted the truth of what the church teaches about this and why the church teaches
And
it.
you know, the survey, Teresa, is very important, because what they did was they took women who are attending Mass, at least on Sunday, you know, frequently, not daily communicants, but at least on Sunday, and then asked their different opinions about the church's teaching. And surprisingly, how many of them did not know the church's real teaching on contraception.
Absolutely.
But they're open to it.
They're
That's
open
what's
to it.
interesting about this study. They respect the church in terms of the women who are practicing Catholics, even if they don't practice contraception the way the church teaches it, or the NFP. They are open to hearing what the church has to say, which I think is significant. Very
It's fascinating.
significant.
Actually, what was really amazing for me, this finding, 33% of the women surveyed did not know that the church is against contraception. They thought it was okay. 33%. So so yes, it is disheartening in some ways, but then it's also challenging, and it's also a possibility that if we catechize well, we can reach these women. And 44% said that they didn't believe it, but they were open to hearing more. So this is something that we have to look at and say, what can we do? How can we share?
We have to take a break. When we come back, Janet will talk more about this and Astrid, but also we have two very, I think, compelling clips I think that people are really going to enjoy. One is with a woman who's much like us. Her name is Cindy, and she's with a program in Michigan called Good Girl Comeback, and she teaches NFP, and she also works within this ministry to help women overcome body image issues and really embrace their Catholic identity. We're going to hear from her. She did a turnaround. Right, she did a turnaround on it. And then we're also going to hear from a young woman from Great Britain who is speaking out for her homeland. She's originally from Nigeria. She now lives and works in Great Britain, and she's speaking out globally against his push for contraception. Thanks for tuning in. This is the brand new season of the Catholic View for Women. I'm Teresa Tomeo. Astrid and Janet and I will be right back after this break. So glad to have you along on our brand new season 3 already of the Catholic View for Women. And in this episode, our beginning episode for this new season, we're talking about this fascinating report that came out about a year ago before the presidential election, what Catholic women think about faith, conscience, and contraception. Janet and Astrid have some of the statistics. We'll get to that in a second. But first, as we mentioned going into the break, we did a compelling interview with a woman who had a big change of heart on the entire issue, and now she's actually out teaching NFP. Let's take a look at what she had to say.
Well, natural family planning, I got into first about 15 years ago. I had fallen away from the church, and my husband and I were getting married in the Catholic Church by the grace of God because our parents wanted us to. And at our marriage prep, we heard about natural family planning, and I thought, oh yeah, what do a bunch of men, celibate men no less, know about sexuality? And I didn't think there was anything to it. And I thought I knew exactly what the church taught, which is don't do it. And so I was intrigued by the message this particular person presented because she talked about natural family planning as natural, and that I was interested in. And so I convinced my husband to go to the class, and at the class they went more into the church's teaching, and I was blown away by what I thought I knew about the church's teaching was completely wrong. And I started to look into it and ended up falling in love with the church's teaching. It's ultimately what reconverted me back to the faith, strangely, when it drives many people away. And my husband and I became teachers of natural family planning not long after that. We used it ourselves to avoid pregnancy and then to achieve pregnancy and then to avoid a pregnancy again after that. Well, NFP can be used with a contraceptive mentality, so there has to be some caution exercised in that. But the difference is that God created the act of intercourse, of marital love, of sex, to be two things together, the bonding and the babies. So when you take either of those out of the picture, then you are basically taking what God created and saying, you know, God, I have a better idea. So it also erodes the marriage when you take one of those out of the picture. So what contraception does is it takes the babies out of the picture, and that's the whole contraceptive mentality, is separating babies and sex. And then once you take that out of it, it can erode the marriage, and it doesn't keep God's creation intact. If we have attractive examples, not necessarily physically attractive, but somebody who's living the message attractively and with joy, because ultimately that's what it brings you, is that deep joy of following God's plan. If those kind of people can give the message, I think people are interested, and I think they'll listen, and the seeds will be planted and will bloom into beautiful things. So that message makes me very excited. And the other exciting thing about it is that the younger women who are active Catholics and participating in the sacraments were right there, very interested in the church's teaching and open to it. And that's where, again, the Good Girl Comeback comes in and talking about this message of faith, strong faith, and staying pure and making good choices. And actually, Chelsea and I do a talk to high school seniors about NFP and tying in the abstinence before marriage and how that leads into natural family planning in marriage and the beauty of that and how that can be so fulfilling in a marriage.
And ladies, I think this is an example of exactly what this report is talking about, that once they hear the teachings, that they're open to it.
It's so beautiful.
Yeah.
That is the truth. And you know, you want to know why don't they know? Well, the survey said 72% of those women said they get their information from the homily, you know, in Mass. And so here's where we have to have a little correction here for our priests who don't preach enough about contraception or abortion and those issues that concern women. Well, 72% of them are paying attention to them as the #1 source for their catechesis.
And we're not using it, and we're
And
not taking advantage of that.
We're not evangelizing that. So clergy, do not be afraid to preach about contraception because the women are saying they're waiting to hear from you. They're
It's
waiting.
interesting when you think about, now that I'm married to a newly ordained deacon, the training they go through in homiletics. I know that just from being with my husband and you know, looking at his papers and whatnot, I know a lot of the emphasis on homiletics is always based on preaching about the gospel. So, you know, to give in deference to our priests, maybe sometimes they're thinking, well, I have to preach on this particular gospel versus a particular contemporary topic, but there's always room to tie it in
But you know what?
somehow.
And
The Feast of the Holy Family,
Right.
so many things that
Well, not only that, at Priests for Life, we have information. We actually have a brochure on preaching on contraception, preaching on abortion, and we have homily hints that we send out every week via email for them.
So basically,
They're
you're saying
taught-
there's no excuse.
There's
Exactly.
no excuse. Exactly. You know,
We need to hear about it. Well,
contact us. We'll
let's
help
go
them.
to another clip, and this one I'm very excited about. Janet, we caught up with our new friend Uju Ikiocho,
Yeah.
and
I'm glad you can say her name, Teresa.
I'm learning. It's a beautiful African name, and her first name is much longer than Uju, but that's what she's called by her friends because it's a long and distinctive name. But I met her over the internet and finally in person in Rome when Jan and I were there for a pilgrimage with Priests for Life, and we pulled her aside to do an interview. Her story is so interesting because she is a devout Catholic raised in Nigeria, working in the medical field now in Great Britain, and was very, very upset when she heard about Bill Gates' wife, Melinda Gates, who also is Catholic, and her push and her dream of just spreading contraception all over the world. This is the answer to prayer.
Well, especially she got upset because of her homeland, Nigeria.
Right, and Africa, which is such a Catholic continent, and so many seminarians and just so Catholic. So she wrote an open letter to Melinda Gates. She sent the letter to me. I read it on the air. It took on a life of its own. And she recently had her own, she actually organized it with the bishops in Nigeria, her own pro-life conference, raising the issues about contraception and standing up against it. But we caught up with her in Rome for the pro-life event there, and here's what she had to say about contraception and what she sees it doing, not only to her country, but to women in society around the world.
Well, I had seen the interview that she had on CNN, and it shocked me because of the boldness of the untruth she was presenting about Africa. So I had to write it. All I could think about were all my sisters and aunties and, you know, friends in Nigeria who she was supposedly presenting and representing, and I had to respond. I had to say no. She had said that that she met women in Nairobi in Kenya who wanted contraceptives, but that didn't sound like the African woman. You know, that I grew up in Africa all those years, and I just started writing to say no, don't do this. But at first it started off as reasons. Just, it wasn't supposed to be an article. It wasn't supposed to be an open letter. All I wanted to do was just to write the kind of effect how contraception was going to bring to my people, and just some of the things that were diametrically opposed to our cultural heritage as Africans. So I had to write it, and it started as with a few lines, and then it grew and it got bigger and bigger and bigger, and I just kept writing. 5 hours down the line, it had become an open letter, and I didn't know what to do with it. I thought, well, if I send this to Gates Foundation, surely they'll throw it out through the window. I will send it to someone who will care to at least read it. And then I went to your website, and I sent it to the email address that was there, and you took it out and launched it boldly to the world. So all I wanted, as I said, was just to show it to somebody. And the day I sent it honestly to you, all I thought you were going to do with it was to have the points and to have the facts that really Africans are not asking and scrambling and scraping for contraception. That was all. And then you read it, and one thing led to another, and you know, the rest it just became a domino effect, that I would say God started off with you, and now it's gone so far, it's gone beyond me, and it's all the better because now I know really has nothing much to do with me. All I just did was to write the letter. Well, with what has happened to me, surely anybody, you know, God can use anybody. All it takes is the fiat to say yes. Yes to God, yes to the promptings of the Holy Spirit. I don't know if I mentioned to you, but I had just prayed the Rosary, 5 decades of the Rosary, and that led me to this point where I had to write the letter. And so it was as if the words didn't even come from me. So anybody, God can choose to use anybody, but I think our job is to stand firm and say, yes, Lord, I will do whatever you want me to do, however you want me to do it, as long as you want it in the way you want it, just because you want it. So that is the story of me and the open letter. I've just come back from Nigeria, where we had a massive conference for life, which is really a first of its kind, at least in this part of Nigeria. And while I was there, a lot of people were asking, we need to do this more often. We need to do this more often. So I'm hoping that if God has chosen to use me in this way, maybe I will have to face Africa a bit more closely to serve the gospel of life among my people, and bring the gospel of life and the message of life to my people, especially in this age and time when it's obvious that on the international stage, there are definitely people who are real proponents of the culture of death, specifically directed towards Africans. So I'm hoping that God will use my little life.
So I think when we hear from someone like Uju, and then we look at the negative impact contraception has, it really, I think, compels all of us. And we were chatting before we were here on the air on the show, how we want our priests to preach it, but those of us who have come full circle, Janet, like the two of us,
Well, we have to be
able to put it forth.
We can't just say the priests don't preach about it. Although with Hispanics, I got to say, they really do listen when a priest shares something in the homily. They do. But at the same time, we can't look and say, well, they didn't share, so that's the reason why it's a problem. All of us, especially those with testimonies, have more of a reason to say, I've got to get this information out. Just like somebody who has found the faith and is just willing to share the apologetics and everything. Well, in the same way, these teachings like contraception, and now that we have so much information,